proceed through the remainder of this important statement,
Right.
and then we will have the other two witnesses.
The first front company, Al-Ain Al-Jariyah, was given several contracts totaling $850 million. Three of these contracts were for M-18 military helicopters. The front company charged $4.5 million for helicopters that cost only $1.5 million during Saddam Hussein's regime. Not only did Al-Ain Al-Jariyah overcharge the Iraqi government, the company never delivered the M-18 helicopters. A team of Iraqi army officers traveled to Poland and Russia to inspect helicopters that were scheduled for delivery to Iraq. When the team arrived to inspect the equipment, they did not find the 64 M-18 helicopters. Instead, they found 4 repainted, defective helicopters that were more than 25 years old. The team rejected the helicopters and the Iraqi army refused to accept them. But instead of demanding repayment from Al-Ain Al-Jariyah for the useless helicopters, the Ministry of Defense renegotiated with the companies for a series of mobile toilets and kitchens, which have never been delivered. Helicopters were not the only military equipment that was not delivered by these front companies. Despite having been paid in full, the two companies delivered only a small percentage of the other weapons and military equipment that had been ordered by the Ministry of Defense. Major items like airplanes and vehicles either never arrived in Iraq or were unusable. Rusted, decades-old weapons were painted over to look new, but many of them did not work. Bulletproof vests were defective and could not be used. All of this left the Iraqi army without the helicopters, airplanes, armored vehicles, functioning weapons, and bulletproof vests that the army needed to stand up and shoulder the burden of this war. Even as the Iraqi army could not fight for lack of equipment, corrupt Ministry of Defense officials used these front companies to enrich themselves by diverting hundreds of millions of dollars, which should have gone to military equipment and weapons. Iraqi and U.S. soldiers have died as a result of these criminal acts, yet not one of these criminals has been held accountable by the Iraqi or U.S. governments. American financial assistance meant to strengthen the Iraqi military and stabilize Iraq not only made it into the pockets of corrupt officials. These same funds actually helped finance Al-Qaïda terrorists who have been killing American soldiers and Iraqi citizens. CPI investigators uncovered the transfer of funds from these front companies, Al-Ain Al-Jariyah and Safin, to terrorists. The CPI discovered that one of the owners of Al-Ain Al-Jariyah, Nair Muhammad Ahmad Jumaili, the brother-in-law of the current Minister of Defense, diverted a portion of these funds to Al-Qaïda in Iraq. Informers have told me that Mr. Jumaili traveled to Amman, Jordan, to deposit money into the accounts of Al-Qaïda operatives. On his way back from Jordan, he was given safe passage through the city of Ramadi, Iraq, which was controlled by Al-Qaïda at the time. Mr. Jumaili was a well-known Al-Qaïda supporter, and he and his attorney also worked with the Minister of Defense to release imprisoned Al-Qaïda terrorists. Mr. Jumaili also enriched himself and through kickbacks to the Ministry of Defense officials and as a middleman for contracts between the Iraqi government and American companies. As a middleman for the American company AM General, Mr. Jumaili's front company received $59.7 million on a contract to deliver Humvees to the Iraqi army. In a letter dated June 8, 2005, AM General authorized Mr. Jumaili's company to, quote-unquote, conduct all financial transactions, end quote, related to its contract with the Ministry of Defense. In its contract, AM General was to deliver 510 Humvees. It delivered no more than 167, despite the fact that AM General received all its dues since 2005. I have copies of these invoices and documentation from Iraq's independent auditing agency, the Bureau of the Supreme Audit, that support this finding. Another middleman, Raymond Samir Zaina, served as a go-between for contracts between the Ministry of Defense and the American company Oak Technology. Like Mr. Jamali, Mr. Zaina illegally skimmed money off the top of contracts and kickbacks and paid kickbacks to the Ministry of Defense officials. Brushka Nouri Shawis, the Minister of Defense's Secretary General, gave Oak Technology a contract to, quote-unquote, inventory, assess, recover, and sell all of the Iraqi Ministry of Defense material described as scrap military equipment in the territory of Iraq, end quote. Mr. Shawis also gave Oak Technology a $24 million contract to repair tanks. Although Oak Technology submitted millions of dollars worth of invoices to the Ministry of Defense, the work was never performed. I have copies of these invoices and documentation from the Bureau of Supreme Audit that the contracts were not properly executed. Mr. Zainez, with authority from Oak Technology and the front company, the General Investment Group received $24.7 million from the Iraqi government for this contract, despite the fact that the work was never completed. During my 3 years as an investigator at CPI, I investigated hundreds of areas of fraud and corruption. I'm convinced beyond a shred of doubt that American soldiers died because of this corruption. Because of corruption, the Iraqi army's tanks were not repaired by Oak Technology. Because of corruption, Iraq never received the armored vehicles it ordered from AM General. Because of corruption, Al-Qaïda had better weapons than the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army had to ask the United States for help because it did not have sufficient weapons, which resulted in even more American deaths. Mr. Jamali also enriched himself through kickbacks, as I mentioned before. This overall picture of corruption existed not only at the Ministry of Defense, but across the government of Iraq. Many of the American and Iraqi funded projects registered at Iraq's Ministry of Planning never existed, but this did not prevent Iraqi ministries from fraudulently paying contractors for quote-unquote ghost projects, end quote. The Iraqi companies that registered these contracts with the Ministry of Planning would receive payment for the bogus projects and then launder the money back to Iraq through a non-Iraqi bank, usually in Syria, the United Arab Emirates, or Jordan. Having enriched themselves by keeping the money and not performing the work, and enriching Iraqi government officials by paying bribes and kickbacks, these companies would then routinely reincorporate themselves under different names for the purpose of receiving new contracts. You might think that the Iraqi government would support our efforts to uncover this corruption. That is not so. Many in the Iraqi government profit from the corruption I have described. So sadly, our efforts did not have the support of many in the Iraqi government, most notably the Prime Minister, who actively interfered with the anti-corruption efforts of CPI. Prime Minister al-Maliki routinely blocked corruption investigations and directed government officials not to cooperate with our efforts. Ministers and other top government officials routinely blocked investigative efforts and threatened CPI employees. Mr. al-Maliki and top Iraqi government officials eventually ordered CPI to close its investigations into government officials. The government also interfered with judicial orders to comply with our investigations, and as a result, the CPI employees would be intimidated and prevented from doing their work. When the United States government ignores corruption and waste at the highest levels in Iraq, the government does a grave disservice to the American people. American taxpayers are cheated. American soldiers are killed. And the American mission in Iraq is undermined. All of this sends a terrible message to Iraqis and millions of people in the Middle East who look to the United States to show us how democracy should work. And
Mr. Adhoob, thank you very much. Your job in Iraq required great courage, and so too does your testimony to come before this Congress and provide the opportunity for us to understand and learn from you. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Abbas Medhi, who served